My name is Eric Scott. I'm the director of KU's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And by the way, is this microphone on? Just want to make sure. Yes. Okay, good. So we're really delighted to have the acclaimed Ukrainian author Andrey Kurkov with us here today from Kyiv, by way of many other places, en route to many other places. And we're really excited to have this be our annual Palij Family Lecture. And I want to also mention before I get started, we have some more events coming up this semester and next semester, and Aaron in the back has some materials for you if you'd like to know more about our series at CREES. This event today is really a testament to KU's strength in Ukrainian studies. And this strength was built on the visionary foundations of Michael Palij, who is a native of Ukraine, received his PhD in history from KU, and developed the Ukrainian book collection as a librarian here, and wrote 2 major books on the Ukrainian Revolution as a scholar. Thanks to the generosity of the Palij family, this Palij Family Fund supports the annual visiting Palij Lecture focusing on Ukrainian studies, and also provides an annual Ukrainian Studies Prize to an outstanding student specializing in Ukraine. I want to thank my colleagues and friends Vitaly Chernetsky and Oleksandr Wallo for helping bring Andrey Kurkov here today. And I also want to thank Ezra Predalotz, Megan Luttrell, and Maria Borisova of CREES for all their help with the logistics. I want to give an additional shout out to our local independent bookseller, The Raven, which is here with copies of the author's books, which if you're very nice to him, he might sign for you after the event. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Vitaly Chernetsky, professor in the Department of Slavic, German, and Eurasian Studies, to introduce the author.
And I come with a small selection of things. So it is an absolute pleasure and, of course, also a great honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Andrey Kurkov is a powerhouse in many senses of that word. Not only is he the author of more than 30 books, he is also one of Ukraine's foremost public intellectuals and international spokespersons. I have the distinct honor of having known him for, as we determined, more than a quarter century, as we first met in June of 2000, introduced by another prominent contemporary Ukrainian writer, Oksana Zabushko, to each other at an event in Kyiv. And we have stayed in touch over the years. I was glad to bring him to Miami University in Ohio, where I taught before here. And also, he was a wonderful host to the students and faculty at Miami when I took them to Ukraine on a study abroad. And I can tell that for many of my colleagues, some of them Slavists, some of them historians, other of them anthropologists, that trip to Ukraine, and specifically the night of Andrei's hospitality, was a paradigm shift. And I really understood how much they were missing by neglecting to try to find out more about Ukraine. So a little bit about Andrey as a person and as an author. He was born in 1961. He was born in a small town near Leningrad, but when he was only 2 years old, his family moved to Kyiv, and he's lived in Kyiv ever since. He graduated from the Institute of Foreign Languages, and so he is a person who is also a polyglot, and that's one of the ways that he's been such an amazing public spokesperson for Ukraine is he is fluent in major languages, which is not something that most writers from that part of the world can say, and this is a great thing. But more importantly for us, he is a really talented and versatile writer of many different kinds of works. He graduated from the university in '83, and as he mentioned several times, an important part of his growth as a writer was his mandatory military service that he had to do as a Soviet Union. And his mandatory military service was of an unusual kind. It happened in my native city in Odessa, and he had to work as a prison guard, as a soldier. So that gave him a perspective on the Soviet system that was very different from being a student at an elite university. He was, however, his heart was really in literature and writing. He published his first book just a couple of weeks before the collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union. And in the exciting and chaotic 1990s, he was a very determined person trying to make it as a writer in the new environment and in the new conditions. And we are really grateful for his determination and for him never giving up about those things, because in the middle of the decade, he has achieved a twin breakthrough with two different books. One is this book, in Ukrainian, Picnic na lёду, in Russian, Picnic na lьду, so Picnic on the Ice, in English, Death and the Penguin, the book that became an international hit. And as I was thrilled to learn from the author, a film adaptation is finally in the works, due to be released in 27, so stay tuned for that. But there was also another book, which was called A Friend of the Deceased, or in the book title in English is A Matter of Death and Life. This book was adapted into a film, a really wonderful film, A Friend of the Deceased, a beautiful dark comedy with neo-noir elements, which became Ukraine's most important cinematic success of the 1990s. So with those twin successes, however, these were sort of dark detective story, dark comedies. So we could say that, there was potentially a danger of the writer of being pigeonholed into that one variety, but our esteemed guest is not afraid of dangers, because he is a writer of a great talent and great versatility. So he has been publishing works of many different varieties. He's published children's books. He's published wonderful works of nonfiction, both diaries about the revolution and more recently about life in the conditions of the Russo-Ukrainian War, but also critical essays. He has published fiction of many different kinds, historical and set in the present, things that are more epic in nature and things that are more sort of chamber, focused in nature. Again, a writer of incredible diversity. One of his novels that you may have heard of, and it's available there in the back, Siri Bjoli, Gray Bees. This is a book that has won several major awards, including the Prix Medici Étranger from France and the National Book Critic Circle Award for Best Work in Literary Translation in English. It is also, that has been adapted into a film, and that film is going through its festival release now. So I hope we will be able to bring it as a screening to KU soon. But there are also many other different works, like a book that is much beloved is Jimi Hendrix Live in Lviv, which is a book that delves deeply into Ukraine as a prominent place, in the city of Lviv in particular, for the Soviet-era hippie movement. And it really gets you to experience that from the inside. That, I think, is one of the great talents of our guest, is that he can create these very palpable, believable worlds. When you open the pages of his books, when you delve into them, you are transported into that reality, and it becomes a reality that you can really engage in. But you came here not to listen to me, but to listen to Andrey Kurkov. So without further ado, please give him a warm KU welcome. Please welcome our Palij Lecturer of this semester, Andrey Kurkov.
Hello, thank you very much for these kind words. I didn't expect so much positive about myself, because I mean, usually writers, when they become well-known, they are controversial figures. Some people hate them, some people love them, and they live in between love and hate. And actually that's what I do in Ukraine, because actually there are lots of people who are unhappy with me because of what I think and what I say, and there are people who are happy with me. But in the times of war, actually, I mean, thanks God, the other issues are more important than personal relationship. And actually, I'm very happy that I don't need to talk about myself. I would be if there were no war. But actually, there are other things to talk about. And first I wanted actually just to build a story of Ukrainian culture and literature during the war, but I decided in the end to be eclectic because the audience is mixed. Ukrainian part of the audience knows a lot of things that I would mention. American part of the audience probably doesn't know much. So I mean, it's difficult to navigate in this situation, but I will try. I swim from the age of 5. And I swim well. Yeah, on the 24th of February 2022, we were awoken by explosions outside our windows with my wife. Our children were in Lviv for a short holiday with their friends. And then actually I rushed to a window. We live on Reiterska Street, very famous street next to St. Sophia in Kyiv, on the 4th floor. And 3 or 4 months before that, every evening we were told, including by President Zelensky, that there will be no war. So of course, I mean, some people believed, some people didn't believe. I was expecting an escalation in Donbass, but I wasn't expecting, as everybody else, that all of Ukraine will become victim of this war, and that actually the missiles will land in every region, in every big city. And there at 5 o'clock, actually, I rushed to the window and I was looking down at empty street for 40 minutes until there were 2 more explosions. And then I probably sort of accepted that this is the real war and we should do something. But by that time, the highways and the roads in Ukraine were blocked by families with cars escaping from the east, from the south. And as you know, maybe not everybody knows, that we don't have real highways like in the US, and the main road to the west has sometimes 2 lanes each direction, sometimes 1. And we actually decided to go to find our children on 25th in the morning because I just checked Google Maps and it looks that the road is green, no blocks on the exit, western exit from Kyiv. And we went there, we picked up a friend of ours, a lady with autistic son, and we got stuck 13 kilometers later next to Gostomel and Bucha, and we were listening to the artillery fire and the jets were flying over the cars, and we were standing there probably for a couple of hours before we moved on. And the journey actually on the first day took 22 hours and we didn't make it to Lviv, because some of the traffic jams were 50 miles long, some were 40 miles long, and the further you went, the less petrol you could find, because half of the country was on the move. We actually got to Lviv next morning. I did sleep for 2 hours on the edge of the road, 70 kilometers before Lviv. On the 26th, we found our children at 11 o'clock, but before that, we were passing by a corner. I don't remember the name of the street, but I was there recently. A corner in the center of the city, Lviv, with a hunting weapon shop Stvol. And it was still closed. But there was a queue of young people, including women, waiting for this shop to open. And this was very strange feeling. I mean, like the war came also to Lviv and people were prepared to arm themselves. We found our children and their friends. We put them in the car and we realized that we cannot take them to Polish border because 60 kilometers to Polish border was complete traffic jam. We decided to go via Carpathian Mountains to Uzhgorod. And we got stuck at 1 o'clock in the morning in the Carpathian Mountains between the, well, 60, 70 kilometers from Mukachevo. And it was minus 15, end of February, very little petrol in the car, and 9 people in minivan. Actually, we have minivan. I mean, the decision was what to do, to hit the car and to waste or to spend the petrol and then not have petrol to go down from the mountains, or to find a place where we can sleep, or to get frozen. And I went, I saw a motel not far away from the place where we were stuck. I went there. Of course, there were no free rooms, but the guy at the reception, he was very kind and friendly, and he gave me a telephone number of a young man who, before the war, bought abandoned Soviet tourist hostel somewhere in the mountains. And so actually I called him without much hope, and he picked up. And I explained him that actually we have 9 people in the car, we have problems, and we are stuck. And he explained me how to get to this abandoned hostel. And he came there, maybe 5 minutes after us, bringing electrical heaters, blankets, towels. He put us up, and then he went to the traffic jam, and he brought to this hostel another 15 or more cars with families with children. So, I mean, this was the moment when you saw different Ukraine. Everybody was helping each other. And everybody actually who needed help also was ready to help each other. And we, in the end, came to Uzhgorod. We stayed 1 week with our friends, and then a lady we never met gave us the key from her small apartment on Dostoevsky Street 4. Actually, it's like a good irony. And we stayed there for 4 months. I hope the street is renamed now, but I didn't check the map. It's next to Kapushanskaya. But anyway, and from there I was asked to report on the events in Ukraine. So I was traveling abroad regularly by car, going to Košice and flying from Košice to Austria and from Austria everywhere else. And in the small kitchen, actually, I organized some kind of studio, and I was talking on CNN with a very strange background behind my back. But this was the moment when I accepted that this is a war, and this war is going on, will be for a long time. And I didn't change my mind. I can tell you that I repeat already for almost 4 years that the war will be stopped, maybe not ended, but stopped, only after death of Putin, because this is his last war. And he started this war in order to remain in the school manuals of history for Russian children as one of the most important tsars who managed to make Russia great again. I mean, there are lots of similarities that I see between Trump and Putin, and I can see, as probably as everybody else, that President Trump has respect for authoritarian leaders. He has respect for Putin, for Xi Jinping, for Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Maybe he envies them, maybe not. It's not for me to decide. But anyway, we are now in the fourth, in the 4th year. And the country changed. The country changed, people changed very much. I changed, and I changed not only as an author, because on the 24th of February, 1 day before actually, I had been writing a novel, a new novel. I had 70 pages done, but then for 2.5 years I couldn't touch fiction at all. Because once actually you find yourself in the dramatic situation, in reality, you cannot do anything else except writing describing the reality. So I became a nonfiction writer. I published 2 diaries of about life during the war. The 3rd book is out in English in several days. It's called 3 Years on Fire. But finally, actually, I managed last year to get back to the unfinished novel. I finished it in November. It will be published next year in English. It's called The Lost Soldiers. It's about the war of 1918-1921, the war which was described in Soviet history manuals as civil war after the October Revolution, 1917. History is a very important thing to know if you want to understand anything happening on larger scale. I mean, this war has a lot to do with history. Because, I mean, for me, the war of Russia against Ukraine is the war on 3 levels. The ground level, we can say it is a new war. It is a war with new technologies used, etc. It's war for the territory of Ukraine. It's an imperial desire to expand. And what is interesting also, if you followed, and you didn't need to do it, but I mean, I followed what Putin was saying about Russian history for many years. I remember that he was very fond of Ivan the Terrible, and I could understand why. And then suddenly, maybe 5 years before the beginning of full-scale invasion, he started talking very positively about Peter the Great. And I was puzzled, because Peter the Great was somebody who was open to Europe, who went to Rotterdam, Amsterdam to learn how to build ships, who invited German doctors to settle to Leningrad. Actually, Leningrad was built, Petersburg was built on the territory taken over from Sweden. So actually, it is not Russian territory at all. But, I mean, still, there was a saying in the Soviet times that, that Peter the Great, like, made a window from Russia towards the West, towards Europe. But then actually, quite soon after these thoughts, I understood the reason why Putin is so fond of Peter the Great. Because in 1709, a very famous but not always understood Poltava battle happened, which is, became a topic of Byron's poems, Pushkin's poems, lots of literature. And Peter the Great, in this battle, defeated Swedish army of Karl XII and Ukrainian army of Hetman Mazepa. So if you know the history of Ukraine, and it is a fascinating thing to know, and I will advise you some books later in the end, but in 1654, during the there were many Polish-Ukrainian battles and wars, but this was another war, Ukrainian hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky asked the Russian Tsar to help militarily against Poles. So, I mean, Russian Tsar was happy to help, and actually Russians came to Ukrainian territory to defeat Poles, briefly, and they remained. And this was the beginning of the end of Ukrainian independence. And this is the good moment to talk about difference in mentalities, Russian mentality and Ukrainian mentality, because Russia was always a monarchy. There was always a Tsar, and there were always subjects to the Tsar who either loved the Tsar or didn't like, but anyway, they were loyal, they were afraid, they were waiting for presents from the Tsar, and if they were very unhappy about the Tsar, they would kill this one and adore the next one. Ukraine never had a royal family. On the territory of today's Ukraine, there were small kingdoms, like Kingdom of Danila Galitsky and some other small places, yeah. But we never had Ukrainian royal family. And Ukrainians were run by actually Cossacks Council, and this Cossacks Council would choose a headman, the head of the army, who was also head of the Ukrainian territory. And it was actually a huge territory without fixed borders, because all the borders were front lines. Because Ukrainians were fighting against Turks, against Poles, together with Crimean Tatars against Poles and Russians, then against Russians, and then together with Russians against Poles. And at the same time, there was a legal system. There was a system of military courts. And these courts actually were, unfortunately, sometimes as corrupt as today's Ukrainian courts. Maybe now it is improving the situation, but in the history and in literature about these times, you can find lots of examples of legal corruption. Ukraine had a diplomatic service, because in the archives of Istanbul, you can find correspondence between Ukrainian hetmans and Ottomans of Ottoman Empire. Ukrainians didn't make their own currency. They didn't create their own currency because they thought that actually it's enough to use Polish silver, Russian silver, Turkish gold. And this situation reminds me 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when ruble was dead and people were so happy to use dollars and German marks instead. And it took some time before we got to our hryvnia, which is stable now thanks actually to American help and to European Union help. But what is important that Ukrainians were used to choose their leaders, and then they were immediately ready to replace them. So, I mean, this kind of anarchy in the genetic attitude of Ukrainians, it is still present today. So Ukrainians feel that they can influence the political situation in the country, the direction of the country, where it goes. And this is why, actually, when they are not happy, they go and they organize Maidan, which never happens in Russia. I mean, the only protests in Russia on Bolotna Square were very weak, and it was very easy for Putin to put an end to any kind of protests. I will not mention Russia too much, because I want to talk about Ukraine, first of all. So the main difference is that Ukrainians are individualists, and Russians are collective people. Collective people are very easily manipulated, brainwashed, told what to do, told to whom, for whom to vote. And individualists, each one decides for himself or herself. And that's what we have. And because of this individualism, Ukrainian peasants, Ukrainian farmers didn't want to join collective farms. And this was the reason why actually Russia tried to squash this individualist mentality by deportation of the farmers to Siberia, and later by the artificial famine known as Holodomor. In fact, maybe you don't know that Lenin never came to Kyiv. He didn't trust Ukrainians, which means he was clever. He understood from the very beginning that with Ukrainians you cannot build communist or socialist society because they are individualists, because they don't want to unite. Although, I mean, they unite when there is a danger for the country, and they united in February 22, and they are still united, although less united now than 3 years ago. But this is actually a good thing to study for sociologists and for people specialists on mass psychology, etc. Because, I mean, I'm observing lots of processes. And actually, when somebody says or asks me, what do Ukrainians think about this or that, I have to repeat to people that actually we can say what Russians think. What 40 million of Ukrainians think, I don't know. Because, I mean, even if we think about groups of Ukrainians, now we have more groups than before because of the war. Because we have 15, 20 million Ukrainians who live at home, who are away from the front line, who are more patriotic than those who became displaced persons, who lost their flats and apartments. So we have the large chunk of population living at home. Some of them did lose their relatives. Some houses were damaged, but actually when you live at home, it's a different feeling of stability. And your stability influences your answers to questions about war, etc. Then we have displaced people, about 4 or 5 million, who either lost their land region or lost their accommodation, their apartments. You have 1 million people on the front line who are very patriotic, very motivated, but at the same time very angry and very irritated by disorganizing, well, just by the way some of the units are organized and commanded. And that's why we have invented new word for desertion in order not to demotivate the society and the army itself. So it's called now CZC. It's like leaving your unit without permission. It's not considered a treason, because desertion is a treason. And I mean, like, we have now hundreds of thousands of cases. And people who actually leave their units or leave the frontline positions, they are not afraid. They were there for years without being replaced. They are worn out. They are psychologically unstable. They need help, psychological help, and this help sometimes is too slow. And neither me nor other Ukrainians are ready to blame these people for the fact that they cannot bear it anymore and they need help, they need rest. But yes, coming back to Ukrainian attitude towards the order and legislation and law, etc., they remained anarchists. They remained anarchists in the sense that they now vote for people whom they will destroy later, whom they will criticize and keep guilty for things that go wrong. And we saw it with President Poroshenko. I think I mean, it's a different topic. I don't want to go into Ukrainian politics now because I don't have that much time. And I want still to talk about what is happening today. At the same time, I want, in any case, to talk also about the history. Because I mentioned Poltava Battle, 1709, Peter the Great. Peter the Great was the first person, first Russian Tsar, who signed the first decree banning publication of Ukrainian religious texts. And he ordered in 1720 to remove all the religious texts in Ukrainian language from the churches on Ukrainian territory, which was controlled by Russia. Actually, Russia was not colonizing Ukraine by sword and by gunpowder. Russia was corrupting the aristocracy. And actually, Mazepa until now remains a traitor for Russians because he received free land from Russian Tsar. He became one of the richest people in Russia, and still he wanted to revive independence of Ukraine. So, I mean, this kind of very unstable position of Ukrainian aristocrats and Ukrainian noble people, I mean, this was typical. The same can be said about the last hetman of Ukraine, Pavlo Skoropadsky, who was pronounced hetman in 1918, who was supported by the German army, and the German army stayed in Ukraine until the end of 1919, some units a bit longer, after the end of the First World War. In fact, actually, I'm very deeply now involved in the events of 1919 because I'm writing a series of historical crime novels set in this period in Kyiv. And because I received several years ago a gift, a box with authentic files of Bolshevik secret police, VCK, about the cases, with cases actually happening in Kyiv and around Kyiv from 1919 till 1927. So, I mean, I was fascinated and I am still fascinated by this period. And again, and by the misconception of this period by many people who don't read about history. Because in Russia and by many in Ukraine, this period is called Civil War. The Civil War after 1917 was happening only in Russia between the Red Army and White Army, between Tsarist army, who wanted to restore empire, and Red Army, who wanted to build communist society. Ukraine was involved in 2.5 wars at the same time. There was a civil war, Ukrainian civil war, between two Ukrainian armies, between the army of Hetman Skoropadsky and the army of Simon Petlura, who wanted to build different independent Ukraine. There was Russian civil war in Ukraine, Red Army and White Army. There was German army defending actually Skoropadsky's government. There was the biggest army of anarchists in the world, organized by Nestor Makhno in 1918 in Poltava region, with 35,000 soldiers in the beginning and 80,000 in the end. And first, actually, he supported independence of Ukraine, then he sided with Bolsheviks, and then he was destroyed, and his army was destroyed by Bolsheviks. And the biggest puzzle of that time is Polish army, because in 1921, Kyiv was occupied by Polish army. I couldn't find any novel, any memoirs about this period mentioning and explaining this thing. I mean, I'm sure historians know, or they have their own theory, and I look forward to find out actually what really happened, because I mean, as I understood now, that it's easier to write fiction about the past than about today's, about what is happening today. Yeah, but let me touch on some subjects which are very important. What happens to somebody who finds himself, herself suddenly in the middle of the war, under the shellings, etc. So you start feeling different things than before because you have different priorities suddenly. So I mean, survival, life of your loved ones becomes more important than anything material. And I was a very material boy in the sense that as a child, I was a collector of stamps, old coins, old icons. We have still collection of paintings at home and old gramophones. And on the 24th of February 2022, all these collections lost sense. So actually, when we were leaving our apartment in a car, my wife took a Bible, with her and some clothes. I didn't take anything at all. And then actually I realized that, I accepted the idea that actually we cannot come back, or we can come back, but there will be no house with our apartment. And actually everything which is material can disappear because it doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to the war. It belongs to not destiny, but actually like fatum. One more thing, I mentioned the word fatum. A big difference between Russians and Ukrainians is in absence or presence of fatalism. Fatalism is a purely Russian phenomenon, practically created and pushed and promoted by Dostoevsky, which, the fatalism actually is something that present is today in Russian army. The way they are committing suicides during the battle, or when they are attacked by drones, it shows that they see no other way out. So, what happened also, I told you that I will be eclectic. I'm going now back to myself. Before the war, I couldn't describe in my novels anything violent. I couldn't describe blood or some nasty things happening to characters. Now I can. The war taught me, made me tolerant to violence, because violence is present every day in the news. People getting news not now from official TV channels, but from YouTube, from Telegram. And every unit in Ukrainian army, as well as every unit in Russia, they are using their Telegram and YouTube channels to promote themselves, to find more volunteers or more contract soldiers who could join them. So they are showing, without some kind of blurring, how they kill the enemy. And actually, I have probably 10 or 12 Telegram channels which I follow. And every morning I want to see what is happening, what happened overnight on the front line, and every morning I see just death recorded by the drones. So, the drones are killing and recording the murder. The same is happening. The Russians are watching the same TV channels, Telegram channels and YouTube, watching how they are killing Ukrainians. And in this situation, I think this is a trauma that will remain after the war. For Ukrainians now, there is an acceptance that a mass death is happening and can happen, and it is normal, because it is war. War makes things normal which wouldn't be normal otherwise. And I don't know, I'm not sure if I want to go to psychologist after the war or not. I will see, because I think I can analyze myself. I had been experimenting actually with psychoanalysis as a student. So I'm used to try to analyze my reaction and reactions of my friends to different events. But we do have different society, and we will have different society. And of course, it's very difficult to predict what will be the result. I have imagination as a writer, and I can see what is the best way out after the war for Ukrainians to get back to normal. And it can happen actually if it will be clear that the war is over, and that we will have a huge influx of foreign young volunteers coming to Ukraine to help Ukrainians to rebuild the country. So if we have this influx, then many Ukrainians who became refugees and who are now reluctant to go back, they will think that maybe they will go back. And then it will be a good example for Ukrainians inside Ukraine to get energy and to join somebody who came to help them from afar. And this actually, I think this is a very important moment. If it happens, then Ukrainian society will cure itself maybe within 10, 15, 20 years. If not, it's difficult to imagine what can happen, because if there is no temptation, actually, to natural temptation to rebuild the country, to restore normal life, with demographical crisis that we have now and we might have after the war, there are not many good prospects. Well, I touched about the history. Did I say everything? Not, I didn't say everything. Actually, 1720, it was the first decree against Ukrainian national identity, against Ukrainian language. Between 1720 and 1917, there were 40 decrees by different Russian tsars. And the most important were, of course, the law signed by Catherine the Great about ban on education in Ukrainian language in Ukraine. So after that, the oldest Ukrainian, one of two oldest Ukrainian universities, Kyiv Mohila Academy, had to start teaching in Russian. So, I mean, Russian language, although it is my mother tongue, is guilty in many situations in suppression of Ukrainian national identity. The national identity is made of three elements: language, culture, and history. From 1720, practically, Russia was following a policy of replacing Ukrainian language with Russian language where they could do it. What happens with identity when the mother tongue is replaced with a foreign language? In this situation, foreign culture and foreign history becomes your history. So, I mean, if it is Russian language that you start speaking instead of Ukrainian, then you are part of Russian culture and you are part of Russian history. And this is what actually was always the purpose of Russian expansionism and imperialism, because they wanted to control the land. The land shouldn't have any kind of historical and cultural connection with people who live on this land. So, I mean, Ukrainians, because of identity, they had connection with Ukrainian territory, with Ukrainian steppes, with Ukrainian Carpathian mountains, with Dnipro, with Zaporizhia, with Kam'yana Mohyla, because, I mean, the culture is creating this connection in the language of people who live there. So the myths, the legends, the songs about trip to get salt, Chumaks songs, they show, probably one of the best examples, how people are connected with the land on which they live. The connection is through the language. If you remove the language, then the songs are forgotten and they are replaced with the songs in different language. And then these new songs will not tell you about Ukraine. They will tell you about Russian connection with this land. And this was happening actually recently in 22, 23, when Kherson, part of Kherson region was occupied, and Russia put everywhere billboards with Pushkin's portraits and his quotations that Kherson region, Tavria, is a beautiful corner of Russian Empire. I have photos of these billboards. They are still there. And actually, the story is repeating itself because on the occupied territory of Ukraine, in the schools, education in Ukrainian language is banned again. And the books in Ukrainian are removed from the libraries. And still, the children can learn Ukrainian as a foreign language using the manuals recently printed in Russia for these kids. Manuals where you can read in Ukrainian language about your love for the Kremlin, for Moscow, for Russian history. I don't know, I should be checking the time not to... Oh,
Okay.
oh yes. Do I have still to...
Yes.
Oh, well, okay, yeah. Very important about culture, because in February 2022, the life stopped in Ukraine. Theaters closed down, bookshops closed down, everything closed down. Kyiv was empty. Actually, when we managed to get to Uzhhorod, our youngest son, who was 18 at the time, he said, I will not stay with you, I'll go back to Kyiv. And he took Uzhhorod-Kyiv train. He was the only passenger on the train with 16 carriages. It's a separate story. I mean, it's a fascinating story. He will remember it until the end of his life, seeing actually empty Kyiv with checkpoints with military every kilometer or 2 kilometers, also on Krещатик. But most of the artists, most of the writers moved from Kharkiv to Kyiv and then from Kyiv to Lviv. And Lviv became cultural capital, but a bit overpopulated. And of course, there was no mood to organize book discussions or philosophical clubs or musical concerts. So, I mean, there was a very difficult time for several weeks. And then when Ukrainian army managed, without help from the Western allies, to drive Russian army from Kyiv region, suddenly Ukrainians started believing that they can win, that they can actually liberate all the regions occupied or annexed. And there was a move back to Kyiv. And at the same time, actually, I should say that Kharkiv intellectuals, including Sergei Zhadan, who is the most famous now poet and a writer and musician, he never left Kharkiv together with his friends. And actually, once there was some kind of feeling of optimism, he started organizing book presentations and musical concerts on the platforms of the metro. And it started from Kharkiv, and then Kyiv took it on. So, I mean, we also had concerts on the platforms, concerts and book discussions in the bomb shelters, and the cultural life suddenly revived underground, and everybody was so excited because people were saying that actually supporting Ukrainian culture is supporting Ukraine. I mean, subconsciously they were supporting national identity, but I mean, this is a term for specialists. For ordinary people, to buy Ukrainian books was to support Ukrainian independence. And there was a rise in book sales, and in 2023, 13 new bookshops were opened in Kyiv. And people were buying books not to read, to support. At the same time, actually, novelists were not writing novels. They were writing non-fiction about the war, about Ukrainian soldiers, about refugees. And there were probably hundreds of these books written, published. Not many of them were read, but they were bought also as a sign of support. And then in 23, beginning of 24, suddenly fall in the book sales and fall in the interest in the literature about the war. Because people got tired. Because actually, if you live listening to the sirens and to the explosions, and you watch the news about the battles and about the victims of this war, you get very tired when you start reading about the war. So you cannot be surrounded 24 hours by the war. In fact, actually, in the beginning of the war, but not in the very beginning, probably from April, when theaters reopened in Kyiv, people rushed to theaters. It was impossible to buy tickets for the theater performances because people were looking for escape from the reality for 2 hours, for 1 hour, for 3 hours. And then Ukrainian playwrights started writing plays about the war. So now we have in every theater also plays about the war. And if you cannot find a ticket for a comedy, you buy a ticket for a play which is available. So actually, in Ukraine, there is no escape from the war. It can be possible to do if you are a refugee abroad, but it is a different issue and different problems. Yeah. And even now, actually, theaters are full. But I was talking today to my publisher who is based in Kharkiv, and he was saying that probably soon there will be bookshops closing down again because the sales of books is falling down every month. And people are now reading foreign bestsellers translated into Ukrainian language. So actually, active readers stopped reading Ukrainian non-fiction. Ukrainian fiction is still okay. It is still read, but it is not much written. So there is a problem. And the strange result of this problem is that some publishers, including my publisher, Alexander Krasovitsky, because he has nothing to publish, he started writing fiction himself. Political fiction about Putin, about future of Ukraine, future of Russia, and things like this. So life is very dynamic, as war is always very dynamic. And well, now I hope that the war will be over next year, which means that Putin will die next year. But it's actually my wishful thinking. We don't know what will happen tomorrow, but we know what will happen if Ukraine loses the war. And one of the quite well-known politologists, German of Italian origin, Carlo Massala, just published a book which is called After Ukraine Loses, the Scenario for Europe. And there, with dates in 27, 28, 29, he writes how European Union will probably disintegrate, how Estonia will be attacked from the sea and from the inland. Narva will be occupied, and the island Hiiumaa, and how European Union with America will be reluctant and too slow to react to what Russia would like to do, including to take part of Lithuanian and Polish territory in order to create this Suwalki corridor to unite Kaliningrad region with Belarus, which is already de facto part of Russia. Well, I think I probably will stop my eclectic talk on this topic, and I don't know if Vitaly, you will start asking some questions, and then I will be happy to answer all questions you have.
All right, let's. Okay, yes. Thank you so much, Andrey. Thank you for sharing with us both your perspective, the vision, your hopes, the background, and the feeling of the challenges that we have now. I guess it is important indeed to remember that this is a war that has been going on for a long time. And you talked about two things that are both true at the same time, but they may be contradictory, may seem contradictory for outside observers, but also for Ukrainians themselves. There has been a lot of talk about how amazing is Ukrainian resilience. And resilient Ukrainians who can mobilize, who can do all these amazing things, who can crowdfund, who keep on donating, who made sure that the soldiers at the front line have warm clothes and right shoes and also night vision goggles and all of those other kind of things. So self-organization, which also goes back to the older times, and this resilience. But you also mentioned the stresses, the pressures. So this is something that Ukrainians wonder and the world wonder, in that as this war goes on, where do we draw more senses, more energy? How do we rebuild? How do we stay resilient? What are the dangers, but also what are the hopes? How do we sustain hope?
Well, I mean, I can probably tell, first of all, that in spite of the very difficult situation on the front line and slow but steady advances of the Russian army, there is no despair in Ukraine. So, I mean, there is no pessimism or depression. There is a lot of anger. There is a lot of bitterness. And, of course, I mean, Ukraine has to fight on two fronts at the same time. I mean, like right now we have a scandal connected with corruption. So, I mean, Ukraine is fighting inside the country against corruption. And corruption is, we don't have grassroots corruption anymore from Yushchenko's time. But we have corruption on the level of the state orders, state purchases, high politics, etc. And that actually makes people more angry, this corruption, than the Russian advances. So because actually but the Ukrainians understand that they are doing for the army not less than Ministry of Defense, maybe more. And this is true actually. The Ukrainian army is crowd-funded. You have everywhere people collecting money for different units, for different purposes. We have, of course, I mean, Western help. I mean, I was yesterday in Oxford, Ohio, and they just sent an ambulance to Ukraine. They collected money, they bought an ambulance, they paid for the equipment, and now this ambulance is in Rivno region, town Dubno. And Ukrainian artists and writers are collecting for the army. One of the most productive, young and charismatic writers, who is from Uzhgorod, Andrey Kurkov, just bought a second-hand pickup truck number 400. So, I mean, can you imagine? Sergei Zhadan collected money and bought more than 300 cars. So we are talking about not only clearing, actually, garages of Western Europe, but I mean, we are supplying the army with the cars with which Ministry of Defense cannot supply the army. So, I mean, this is a people's war. It's not a war of the state. Because everybody understands that if Russia takes over Ukraine, the priority of Ukrainians, the most important thing of Ukrainians, freedom, will be gone. Because for Ukrainians, freedom is more important than stability. For Russians, stability is more important than freedom. That's why actually Russians gave up their freedom so easily in 22 years of Putin's rule. And in fact, I mean, if you think about Maidans, the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, I mean, people who were there, and I was there, I was more involved in Orange Revolution than in Euromaidan, but they were aware of these consequences. So, I mean, they were sacrificing stability for freedom, for the dream to become a European nation, to clean the society from corruption, etc. And of course, I mean, this was also something that provoked Russia, that actually told Russia that if they don't take over Ukraine, it will happen in Russia, because I didn't share with you one of my theories, and I have lots of theories. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine could be divided into two parts, not according to any administrative borders, but according to the border between individualist Ukrainian mentality and collective Soviet mentality. And this border was cutting Ukraine in half, not along the Dnieper River. And of course, I mean, the most collective region in Ukraine was Donetsk, Donbass, where this industrial hierarchy remained in power, but instead of communists, the local oligarchs took over. And everybody was passive and not interested in politics and waited for the instructions for whom to vote. At the same time, thanks to three regions of Galiciana, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil, which became part of Ukraine de facto only after the Second World War, this individualist geist, the ghost and the priority of being free remained in Ukraine, together actually with the priority of Ukrainian language and importance of the Ukrainian language and culture for the national identity. And from there, actually, after collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian identity and mentality was returning back to Russified and so collectivized territory of Ukraine. In fact, actually, what was happening that the language was expanding back slower than the mentality. So at some point you had a lot of private entrepreneurs in the center and in the west of the country, and almost no private entrepreneurs in Donbass and Crimea. And so if we didn't have this war, maybe 20, 30 years later, the borders of mentality would coincide with the border with Russia. So Ukraine and Russia would be just divided by the border of the mentality, and then it would be impossible actually for Russia to rely on any kind of pro-Russian people, mostly retired people in Donbass or retired people in Crimea or even in Kharkiv region.
Okay, this is, I think we should give a chance for others, and I see two hands already. So, Ihor, I saw your hand first, so.
Dear Andrey, thank you very much for your great presentation. This is not the secret that we know each other, for the while. I'm teaching here the two courses in Ukrainian history and with a special focus on East European history as well. And it's not easy to deliver my information to the American students. Different mentality and different vision of the world, because for un-Americans, it's a specific that it's very pragmatic. And if we can to imagine that in one day you came to my class, in which worlds you can to deliver the information for un-American students, what is the interest of the United States of America in the war between Ukraine and Russia? Why America should to support Ukraine in this war?
Well, in the beginning of my eclectic talk, I mentioned that this war is run on three levels, but I mentioned only ground level, the war for the territory. The second level, the middle level, is the war of Russia which is very old war, 300 years old, against Ukrainian national identity. And the third level, the high level, is the actually geopolitical war between the countries defending the idea that authoritarian states are more reliable and more resilient and can survive against the countries where democracy is a value. So, I mean, America and European Union are supporting Ukraine in this war by giving weapons to the ground war. But generally, actually, we are defending democracy. We are defending democracy even in Hungary, although the leadership of Hungary is not democratic. But generally, this is the war which should show whether the authoritarian countries will rule most of the world, or the countries which appreciate human rights will be influencing the other part of the world. So, I mean, it is political domination, but it is also, of course, I mean, there are also economic interests. I mean, for me, they are secondary. I understand that actually, like for President Biden, the geopolitics was more important than pragmatic interests. For President Trump, pragmatic interest is more important than geopolitics. He's not into geopolitics. He is a businessman. So this is why actually he is not as supportive for Ukraine as some other leaders of democratic countries.
Yes, sir.
I can throw my voice. That would actually help. So I'm very grateful first that I can understand English and I was able to come to your conversation and I can understand you in English. So I think my question comes from a fact that when you say that the nation is constantly, perpetually in war, then when that February thing happened, then how, and it's not stopping, the war is still there. How has that changed? You did glimpse upon it as to you were talking about that. Like how does the war has changed you as an individual? That is the first. And the second is that what makes you be in this space and still being in that country and finding your purpose, finding your meaning, that, you know, you have to do something. So how does that sort of play in your everyday thought is my question.
Thank you. Well, I love my country, first of all. And I mean, my family is quite different from many other families. My wife is English of Irish and Scottish origin. My 3 children, who are now adults, they were born in Britain and grew up in Ukraine and went to Ukrainian schools, and they speak Ukrainian, English, and Russian. They don't speak Russian anymore because of the war. They speak actually between themselves English and Ukrainian to me. But I mean, have you been to Kyiv? Well, I mean, Ukraine is a place, if you fall in love, especially if you grew up there, you cannot imagine it being destroyed, raped, mistreated, etc. So, I mean, I can imagine that if Kyiv is destroyed, if I have nowhere to live, I will go to the countryside. And if I cannot stay in the countryside, I can become theoretically a refugee, and I will be the most unhappy person in the world if I have to leave Ukraine. How did the war change me? Well, it changed everybody, as I said. What happens that the stability is gone. You have to learn a lot of things. If you don't want to become a refugee, you have to learn how to survive, how to travel, because we don't have aviation from the 23rd of February 2022. The last plane, it was Lufthansa plane for Munich, left at 15:00. I knew 1 passenger on this plane. Since then, there was no aviation, so I need to travel either 600 or 800 kilometers to the border every time I go abroad. I should cross the border either in a queue, and this queue can last for 8 hours, or in the night on foot, which I did in the summer because it was impossible to buy train tickets. Then I would drive to Shehini, Lviv region, leave the car on the parking of the hotel, and at 3 o'clock, when there are not so many people crossing the border on foot, I would go, and at 5 o'clock I would be in Poland waiting for the 7 o'clock train to either Rzeszów or Krakow. You have to learn a lot, But also what you should understand that if there is a war, you don't save money. I mean, Ukrainians, once they returned to Kyiv, they started going to restaurants more often than before. They were subconsciously trying to save money, to spend money before they are killed or the money are gone because of the inflation, because everybody knows that the war brings inflation. I mean, this is a miracle now, thanks to, as I said, European Union, that we don't have inflation. We have stable situation, which will be over sooner or later. So, I mean, after that, everybody will have to start from the zero. And yeah, I mean, I'm ready for this. I mean, I'm ready for that. I have plan B, plan C. So, I mean, that's what happened, that when you live in an unstable situation, you have to try to foresee every bad thing that can happen to you, to your property, to your relatives, etc. Yeah. So you accepted the war, you accepted your own death. This is the main thing. If you cannot accept your own death, you have to leave the country.
So you had quite a bit of historical examples, like with the Northern War with Mazepa, with the quote-unquote Civil War, which was actually a war for independence, and also Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, and everything. So my question is, do you think this is this 21st century warfare is a new kind of warfare, or is it kind of a return to this pre-20th century kind of imperial warfare that lasts for 20, 30 years that people live through for a while and everything? And how do you think this war in Ukraine is changing the warfare, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole world? Like historically speaking.
Well, I mean, you asked three questions instead of one. First of all, this is a war which is much more close to the First World War than to the Second World War. But it is fought using the high technology, the drones. And of course, I mean, the drones, the usage of the drones, which was a surprise for NATO and for American generals, that you can actually stop tanks with small drones. So in this sense here, every future war will be developing technologically. And it will not be relying on numbers of soldiers or numbers of tanks. And this is probably very important also for the reform of NATO and of the armies of the states and other countries. I mean, the fact that Ukraine is now producing drones together with Western European companies, and there are plans to produce drones together with the US. It shows that actually that this was what helped to defend Ukraine, to defend from the quick advances of the Russian army. I mean, Russia is huge. Russia is bringing Africans to assemble Iranian drones in Tatarstan. So there are lots of people from Central African Republic, from Mali, etc. They are bringing North Korean soldiers and preparing to use them soon in Zaporizhia region. But they are producing a lot of drones, and this is the decisive thing, actually. Who will produce more, and who will produce drones which will be more sophisticated than the enemy's drones? Yeah.
I have a question. You said you get those files from NKVD in Kyiv 19. Tell us some examples of the interesting stories from those files.
Well, on the 6th of February 1919, the Bolsheviks occupied Kyiv for the second time. First time was 1918. There are similar things. I mean, there are parallels with the invasion of 2022 because Red Army used the same level of violence against civil population as Russian army in Bucha, Gostomel, Borodyanka, Moshchun, and other places. And what was interesting that on the 10th of October 2022, the same streets were shelled in Kyiv, which were shelled by General Muravyov of Red Army in 1918. The cases in these files, some of them were criminal cases, some of them were, I would say, not really criminal, but they were talking mostly about the crazy laws that the Red Soviet authorities were trying to introduce. For example, they introduced a monopoly on the meat sale and leather sale. So according to this law, people could have live pig, but didn't have right to slaughter it and didn't have right to sell the meat. So I mean, one case which I used in the second volume of this series, which is called Stolen Heart, it's a case of two friends in Pushcha Voditsa, which was mentioned today, a beautiful suburb in Kyiv where I spent my childhood. Two friends, one of them exchanged somewhere a pig for 40 or 50 kilos of salt. Everything, I mean, was deficit at that time. And then they brought this pig to a barn of the second friend, and they slaughtered this pig, and they sold the meat. And both were arrested because a Soviet policeman was walking along the street and saw blood next to the barn inside the courtyard of private house, and he reported. So, I mean, the Cheka thought that there was a murder. They sent people to check. They found out that there was a pig slaughtered, and both guys were arrested. I used their real names in the novel. So one in whose barn the pig was slaughtered was accused of running illegal slaughterhouse. And the other one actually was accused of taking part in black trade of meat. So they were both imprisoned for 3 years. But on the paper it was interesting because it said for 3 years or until the end of the war. Yeah. But for the same crime, several months later, people were shot dead by the Soviet authorities. Yeah. So this is one of the examples. Yeah. And there was a Polish mafia in Kyiv at that time. It's another story. But there were ethnic groups, and one of the most dangerous mafias was Polish mafia.
What they did?
Well, the main crime in the winter 1919 was theft of firewood, because it was cold, and the electricity in Kyiv was produced by the wood burning. And so sometimes the wood was stolen from this electric station in Podil, and then Kyiv would be with no lights and with no trams. But more often, the private basements with stocks of firewood were burgled.
That will not be the case. Another question, as a psychologist, because you said you are a little bit psychologist.
Well, I was interested in psychoanalysis more than in psychology.
So explain this interesting phenomena. Before the war, a lot of Ukrainians wanted to leave Ukraine. But after the war, now people much more want to stay in Ukraine, even though the lights are off and there is a lot of hardships. The people change their psychology much more pro-Ukrainian to stay in Ukraine in spite of all that.
Well, I would say that they didn't change their thoughts or psychology, because there are things which can be called genetic memory or genetic behavioral memory. And yes, Ukraine before the war produced millions of economical migrants who were working in Czech Republic, in Poland, in Portugal, in Spain, everywhere. When the war started, actually, I think 200,000 Ukrainian men rushed from abroad back to Ukraine to defend the country. And this phenomenon actually, I mean, it's not ideological. It's the call of the motherland and the desire to defend their land. Because, I mean, this is something which comes, I think, genetically from the Cossacks' times. And, I mean, we lost these volunteers. A lot of them were killed or wounded. But the first part of the war was fought not by the regular army, but mostly by the volunteers who rushed to the front lines, very often without weapon.
Along that same line, how do Ukrainian boys aged 13 to 17 feel about the war, act about the war, or what's the morale like there?
It's very different. In fact, actually, kids who are younger than 10, 11, they never lived in a peaceful Ukraine, because the war started in 2014 with annexation of Crimea in February and never stopped. I mean, it was a quiet period because people were trying not to talk about the war, while the front line in Donbass was 430 kilometers, and there were people regularly killed and wounded along this front line. I remember that when I went with Sergei Zhadan in 2015 along the front line to the border with Russia, to Severodonetsk. And in Severodonetsk, I tried to talk to locals, and they were afraid to talk to strangers. So I saw suddenly two boys, maybe 10 years old, 9 years old, walking along the main street in Severodonetsk, Gvardeyski Prospect, with small Ukrainian flags attached to their jackets. And I asked them if they're afraid or not, and they said, no, we are not afraid. All boys and girls in our class are Ukrainian patriots, but our teachers are traitors. They are pro-Russian. And then actually, after we talked, there were several explosions far away, because I mean the city was 7 kilometers from the front line. And then these boys told me which kind of cannon was used, because they could already differentiate the explosions according to the sound of the explosion. And now, yeah, I mean, you know, Zelensky several weeks ago allowed a young man until the age of 23 to leave the country. So in these 4 or 5 weeks, 100,000 young men left the country. And friends of my younger son left. So he is quite alone, lonely now, yes. But at the same time, lots of them stayed on. And there are actually boys who are coming back, who cannot actually, who don't feel comfortable abroad, who don't want to integrate. So it's very individual, I mean, the decision they take.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Well, thank you. I see you very deep thinking in all different historical perspective, and I try to formulate the question correctly. So yes, in the past war, in 16th century, 17th, there was a coalition, and Polish sent army, or some other, or Sweden sent army to Ukraine. In 1918, and for, you know, also the Germany sent army to Ukraine. And now you nicely describes 3 different levels of the war. And so the question is since everyone understands, especially in the West, geopolitically, there is, it's a war for change of geopolitics, and there's helping with the money and ammunitions and artillery, but no one helping with professional army to Ukraine. So why Ukrainian soldiers have to, you know, bleed and fight for change of this politics?
Well, they are not fighting for the geopolitical changes. They are fighting for Ukraine. Yeah. But the help from the West partially comes because this is a geopolitical war. Because if Ukraine loses, the next victims of Russian empire will be Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. And they are members of NATO. And NATO doesn't want to have direct conflict, direct war with Russia because, of course, of the nuclear war.
All right. We've had a long and passionate and diverse discussion. Please join me one more time in a round of applause for our guest, Andrey Kurkov. And I would be remiss not to remind you that we have our good friends from Raven Bookstore. You still have a chance to buy some books. Some of them are pre-autographed, but that just have the signature. If you want to actually have a chance for our esteemed guests to write something for you directly, he would be happy to do so for at least a few minutes. So do not miss this opportunity. Also, please make sure that you follow CREES on social media, that you are subscribed to CREES email news, and come join us for many more wonderful events that the center will be organizing coming soon, as Professor Scott has mentioned earlier. For now, thank you so much once again.
Can I add a couple of words? First of all, actually, I wanted, and I promised to mention a couple of books about Ukrainian history which are important to read. This Sergei Plokhy, The Gates of Europe. It's the most accessible and easy to read and understand history of Ukraine. But also Timothy Snyder, Bloodlands and Applebaum, Red Famine. And if you can find Martin Pollack's books in English, he's an Austrian historian who recently died, unfortunately, but who was a son of prominent Nazi officer and who was very much involved in the history of Poland and Ukraine. And he wrote brilliant nonfiction books about unknown pages of Ukrainian history, especially about history of immigration from Ukraine to the States and Canada. And one more thing, actually, just a few words about the books that you have here on the table. Grey Bees is a novel that I wrote after traveling along the front line, because this travel made me discover that there was a gray zone between positions of the separatists and Russian army and positions of Ukrainians. And this strip of land was also 430 kilometers long, sometimes 300 meters wide, sometimes 5 kilometers wide, and there were dozens of villages there, and approximately 12,000 people who remained in this zone with no electricity, no gas, no police, no administration, no food shops, etc. And nobody was talking about them. So I decided to write a novel, Grey Bees, about two men who were enemies from the childhood and who remained the only inhabitants of the village. And one of them, the main character, Sergei, he is a beekeeper. He was divorced. His wife went to live in Vinnytsia with his daughter. And he doesn't understand, as many people in Donbass, the reason for this war. So first he defends his bees. Then he understands that because of the war, the honey is bitter, because gunpowder, burned gunpowder, falls on the flowers, and then the bees are collecting the pollen and making honey. And then he waits for the spring to take the bees to an area in Ukraine, controlled Ukraine territories, to organize holidays for the bees and peaceful summer. And then he finds himself in annexed Crimea, looking for his old friend, Crimean Tatar beekeeper. So it's a road movie. It's a history of 3 Ukraines, annexed, occupied, and free Ukraine. And it's a story of 2 enemies who had to become 2 friends in order to survive. And the second book about life during the war, Our Daily War, this covers the events and stories which were not covered by the journalists mostly, from August 2022 till April 24. There are stories about my family, our neighbors in the village, but there are lots of strange, sometimes funny stories. For example, a story how that volunteers were bringing and are bringing lots of stuff into Ukraine as humanitarian aid. It is tax-free, so it's taken without paying customs fees. And some business people were trying to bring their stuff for sale as humanitarian aid. And at some point, Odessa Customs stopped a truck with Hugo Boss suits, which were registered as a humanitarian aid. So this was confiscated, but then actually, when I tried to find out what happened to them, the official answer from the customs was that it was passed on to the army. Well, of course, I remember that Hugo Boss was designing SS suits, uniform, etc., but I'm sure it was not passed to the army. So, there are lots of strange stories like this also in this book. Thank you very much for your attention, and Merry Christmas.